3 Tales of Terror, Hanako-san Chronicles. Based on real stories. Story 1, Seized by Shadows. My encounter with the bathroom girl. The events I'm about to relate occurred exactly 7 years ago. I keep them buried in the deepest recesses of my mind, confined to a mental box secured with imaginary chains that I compulsively check every night before sleep. This is the first time I'm sharing them in their entirety. My name is Yumi Tanaka. I was 13 at the time, in 8th grade at Sakura Elementary School, and I believed I understood the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. Today, my gaze constantly fixes on the dark corners of public restrooms, and my fingers never, ever touch the third door of any row of stalls. Autumn had transformed our school's surroundings into a tapestry of amber and crimson. The afternoons grew shorter, and the shadows in the hallways seemed to stretch a little further each day. Our teacher, Ms. Nakamura, had introduced a new cultural component to our history classes: Japanese urban legends and their sociological significance. This was how the story of Hanako-san officially infiltrated our daily reality. Of course, we were all familiar with the whispers. They said the spirit of a little girl haunted the third-floor girls' bathroom, specifically the third stall. Some swore they heard the toilet flush when no one was there. Others claimed to have seen a short-haired figure disappearing down the corridors after the final bell. But there was a substantial difference between stories told under blankets at slumber parties and the partial legitimization granted by an authority figure. Ms. Nakamura explained that the legend likely emerged after World War II, when many children lost their lives during bombing raids. It's believed that Hanako-san, she explained in that academic voice she used for historical facts, represents those children, especially those who died alone, away from their parents. A heavy silence hung over the classroom. It was one of those moments when history stopped being just dates and names, transforming into something tangible, almost present with us in the room. It was May who broke that sacred silence with a short, dissonant laugh. "How many of you have tried to summon her?" she asked, twirling her pencil between her fingers, her dark eyes examining each of us with that predatory intensity that only popular teenage girls can manifest. Nobody answered. Ms. Nakamura shot her a look of disapproval. But May was impervious to such things. The bell rang, announcing the end of class, but May's words remained suspended in the air like a toxic mist. As I packed away my notebooks, I felt her gaze fix upon me. "What about you, Yumi-chan?" Her tone was mellifluous, dangerous. "You seem like the type of girl who's afraid of her own shadow." May knew exactly where to press. Since the beginning of the semester, I had struggled to build my reputation, to be something more than the transfer girl. I came from a small town, carried the wrong accent, wore the wrong haircut. May, with her impeccable social intuition, had identified in me an irresistible fragility. "I'm not afraid," I replied, my voice betraying the lie with a slight tremor. Her smile widened, revealing a perfect row of teeth. "Prove it." That afternoon, the sun set earlier, as if it too wanted to escape what was about to happen. A group of 5 girls gathered in the inner courtyard. May, her 2 inseparable acolytes, Haruka, who trembled more than I did, and myself. "The rules are simple," explained May, her silhouette outlined by the last orange glow penetrating through the high windows. "You go to the third-floor bathroom, alone, knock 3 times on the third stall door and ask, 'Hanako-san, are you there?' I swallowed hard. And then, May's smile took on an almost feline quality. Then you wait for the answer. Haruka let out a low moan. They say if she answers, you'll die. May completed, and then laughed. Don't be ridiculous. It's just a story to scare children. But there was something in her eyes, a spark of doubt perhaps, that made me question whether she truly believed what she was saying. I'll film everything with my phone, announced Ayumi, the shortest of the acolytes, brandishing her new phone. That way we'll know if you really did the challenge. She can stay outside the bathroom, added May, noticing my look. Only you will enter. The digital clock on my wrist showed 5:42 p.m. The school would be practically empty at that hour. Just a few teachers in the staff room and perhaps the janitor on the first floor. Let's go, I insisted, trying to sound brave. Before I change my mind, as we climbed the stairs in silence, each step seemed to elevate us not just physically, but also beyond an invisible boundary that separated the ordinary world from something more permeable. On the second floor, the distant sound of a broom scraping against the wooden floor made us stop, holding our breath until the janitor turned down another corridor. The third floor was different. It had always been, even during normal school days. There was something about that space. Perhaps the way light entered through the old windows at strange angles, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Now, bathed in the twilight's penumbra, the corridor seemed to breathe, as if the walls themselves were membranes of some vast, dormant organism. The bathroom is at the end of the corridor, whispered Haruka, her voice almost inaudible. We stopped a few meters from the peeling white door. The tiles around the doorframe displayed fine cracks extending like fossilized spider webs. Remember, said May, 3 knocks. The question, and then she made a vague gesture with her hand. What if I hear an answer? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. May shrugged. Then you earn legendary status. Ayumi positioned the camera. I'm ready. Each step toward that door seemed to bring me closer not just to a physical space, but to a threshold that, once crossed, might not allow complete return. I turned to look at the girls. May with her Cheshire smile, Haruka biting her lip, the other two with expressions of anxious expectation. In that moment, I understood. Regardless of what happened in there, something would be forever changed. When I came out, just a minute, I muttered and entered. The third-floor girls' bathroom smelled of something more complex than simple school disinfectant. There was an underlying note, something mineral and ancient, like stagnant water on stones, that never saw the sun. The white porcelain sinks weakly reflected the orange light penetrating through the high window, creating an undulating pattern on the ceiling. When I blinked, I almost immediately noticed the change in temperature. It was several degrees colder in there than in the corridor, the kind of cold that not only touches the skin but seems to infiltrate through the pores, penetrating to the bone. I instinctively crossed my arms, rubbing my hands against my elbows. The stalls lined up against the back wall like silent sentinels, all identical, with light gray painted wooden doors worn by decades of students' hands, all ajar, inviting in their emptiness, except the third one. From where I stood, I could see that only that door was completely closed, as if some invisible occupant had precisely selected that space. I swallowed hard, feeling an enormous weight. My stomach. Just a legend, I whispered to myself, my voice sounding strangely muffled. as if the air itself were denser there. I approached slowly, registering each detail with almost painful clarity. A crack in the tile beneath my left foot, a small darkened stain in the corner of the mirror, the rhythmic and slow sound of a faucet dripping somewhere. Plop, 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 puncturing the silence like a metronome marking the passage of time in another dimension. It was then that I noticed the first truly disturbing detail. While all other metallic surfaces, the faucets, the paper holders, reflected the orange glow of the setting sun, the hinges and lock of the third stall remained opaque, as if absorbing light instead of reflecting it. 8 steps from the third stall, I stopped. A tingling sensation rose up my legs, as if thousands of tiny insects were crawling under my skin. My body seemed to beg me to retreat, to turn around and run. But pride, that terrible, inflammable thing, kept me there. 6, 7, 8, I counted mentally, forcing myself to advance. Standing before the closed door, I raised my hand. My fingers trembled violently like thin branches in a storm. Knock. The first touch sounded surprisingly loud, reverberating against the tiles. Knock. With the second knock, something changed in the bathroom. Not something visible or tangible, but a subtle shift in reality itself, as if the space around me had imperceptibly tilted. Knock. The third knock was followed by absolute silence. Even the dripping faucet had ceased. The air now seemed to press against my eardrums like when diving too deep into water. Hanako-san. My voice emerged thin and trembling, almost unrecognizable. Are you there? For a moment, a long, blessed moment, nothing happened. The bathroom maintained its sepulchral silence, and I felt my shoulders relax slightly. It was just a foolish legend after all. I was about to turn away, already mentally rehearsing how I would describe my bravery to the group outside, when I heard it, a soft movement inside the stall. The unmistakable sound of fabric brushing against surfaces, as if someone or something had shifted position. And then, that voice. I cannot call it childlike, though it clearly belonged to a child. It was a voice that existed at some impossible threshold, sweet and gravelly simultaneously, as if the vocal cords producing it were partially decomposed, or as if it were being filtered through layers of earth. Yes, I'm here. I took a step back, a nervous laugh escaping my lips against my will. It must be May. Somehow she had entered before me, hiding in the stall to play a trick on me. Very funny, I said, my voice oscillating between irritation and relief. Let's see who's there. I stepped forward and pushed the door, expecting to find May crouched on the toilet, trying to contain her laughter. The door moved just a few inches before stopping, as if something were blocking it. I applied more force, hearing the old wood creak in protest, and that's when it happened. Through the space between the door and the floor, a gap of no more than 4 inches, emerged a hand. I cannot adequately describe that hand, though its image is permanently etched in my memory. It was small, clearly belonging to a child, but there was nothing childlike or innocent about it. The fingers were abnormally long and articulated, as if they possessed extra joints. The skin had a bluish pallor, like someone who had remained too long submerged in ice water. The nails, broken and blackened, looked as if they had been used to dig through substances that no child should touch. And then, those impossible fingers closed around my ankle. The contact was like being touched by something that should have been dead for decades. The sensation was wet and freezing, But there was a supernatural strength in that grip. Fingers that pressed not just against my skin, but seemed to sink through it, as if seeking something deeper than flesh and bone. A scream tore through my throat as I fell backward, too terrified to maintain my balance. But the hand didn't let go. Instead, as I moved away, the arm to which it was connected stretched impossibly, as if made of some elastic, unnatural substance. It was then that I noticed another horrible detail. The arm emerged from the darkness, under the stall, not like a normal human limb, but as a pale rod that seemed to extend and contract like an albino serpent, following movements that no human anatomy would allow. The stall door began to open slowly, though I was no longer pushing. The creaking of the wood now sounded like a lament, an ancient and suffering sound. The bathroom lights began to flicker erratically, on, off, transforming the scene into stroboscopic fragments of nightmare. In one of those flashes of clarity, I saw something moving in the shadows of the stall. It was a small silhouette, approximately the size of a 9 or 10-year-old child. But the way it moved, those erratic, almost mechanical movements like a marionette being manipulated by invisible strings, had nothing human about it. In another flash, I glimpsed its face, or what remained of it, completely white eyes without irises or pupils, fixed on me with a hungry intensity. Its mouth opened in an impossible smile, literally extending from ear to ear in a gash that no human face could accommodate. However, the most disturbing thing wasn't its appearance but the awareness that emanated from that creature. There was an ancient and malevolent intelligence in those milky eyes, a deep and distorted knowledge that no child could possess. That thing, whatever it was something that merely used the form of a girl, like a predator that adapts to the environment to better hunt its prey. With a strength born of absolute terror, I kicked that hand. My foot connected with something that yielded in a nauseating way, like flesh in an advanced state of decomposition. A high-pitched sound like the squeal of a wounded animal filled the bathroom, and for one blessed instant, the pressure around my ankle loosened. I didn't wait for a second opportunity. I dragged myself backward, my nails scratching against the tile floor as I moved away from that stall, from that thing that shouldn't exist in our world. I managed to stand up in awkward movements, stumbling over my own feet. The lights continued their frenzied ritual, on, off, each flash revealing that the creature had advanced a few more inches out of the stall. Its movements were irregular, as if each part of its body operated independently of the others. An arm stretching while the torso remained motionless, the head turning at an impossible angle, while the legs dragged like limbs of a dead insect. When I reached the bathroom door, I looked back one last time. The light flickered one final time, briefly illuminating the now empty stall. But I knew, with a certainty that transcended any logic, that she was still there. She had merely chosen to withdraw into the shadows, patiently waiting for the next foolish girl who dared to challenge her existence. I burst into the corridor, nearly knocking over Ayumi, who was still holding her phone. May started to ask something but stopped upon seeing my face. Later, she would tell me that my expression in that moment frightened her more than any ghost story she had ever heard. The days that followed were a blur of denial and rationalization. May and the others insisted that the video showed nothing, beyond me entering the bathroom and exiting in panic a few seconds later. There was no recorded sound, and when they asked what happened, I discovered that my tongue refused to form the words necessary to describe that encounter. Eventually, Everyone concluded that I had simply scared myself with my own imagination. The story circulated for a few days about the cowardly transfer student who fled from an empty bathroom before being replaced by some other teenage drama. But I knew the truth, and somehow I felt that she also knew that I knew. I began to notice small anomalies. Wet spots on the floor near my bed upon waking, a vague smell of mold and something more primitive occasionally emanating from the drains, the sound of childlike footsteps walking in circles on the ceiling during the early hours of the morning, directly above where I tried to sleep. At school, I religiously avoided the third floor. When I needed to use the bathroom, I always took a friend with me, inventing excuses about menstruation or fear of cockroaches. I never, under any circumstances, entered a third stall, in any bathroom anywhere. 3 weeks after the incident, I woke in the middle of the night with a peculiar sensation. Something ice-cold enveloped my right ankle, exactly where those impossible fingers had touched me. Paralyzed by terror, I couldn't even scream as I slowly raised the blanket. There was nothing visible there, but the sensation persisted. That cold, wet grip, like decomposed child fingers closing around my skin. It was then that I heard from somewhere at the foot of the bed a scratchy, childlike voice. "You left me waiting. 7 years have passed since that night. I moved to another city, then to another country. I consulted psychologists, doctors, even a Buddhist monk who performed purification rituals. Nothing helped, because she never left me. In the moments between wakefulness and sleep, when reality becomes malleable, I feel those cold fingers sliding over my skin. On certain nights, I see a small figure standing in the dark corners of my room, watching me with empty white eyes. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm alone in a public bathroom, I hear a childlike voice calling my name from inside. The third stall, asking me to open the door, to finish what I started that day, because that's what Hanako-san does. She doesn't just haunt a place. She attaches herself to you, becomes your personal shadow, your eternal companion. And I know with a terrible certainty that one day, perhaps when my guard is down, perhaps when I finally forget to check under the bed, those long, pale fingers will find my ankle one last time, and this time she won't let me go. Story 2, reflected in the abyss. The mirror. That bled glass is never truly solid. It's a liquid that flows on a timescale imperceptible to our limited senses. This scientific knowledge once comforted me. It explained the ripples in antique glass, the subtle distortions we sometimes notice in reflections. Now, this same knowledge terrifies me, because I know that something can move through that liminal state, something that waits patiently on the other side, watching. My name is Akane Ishikawa. I am 17 years old, or at least I was on the night of Midori Preparatory School's winter festival. Everything that happened afterward has made time a fluid concept, questionable, just like glass. The doctors say I suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder with psychotic elements. They prescribe pills that dull my senses and offer rational explanations that cannot encompass what I experienced. They don't understand that some realities are too vast, too incomprehensible to be contained by the narrow boundaries of contemporary science. They don't understand that there are spaces where our world intertwines with another, and that some of these spaces are framed by silver and glass. Snowflakes fell like tiny dying stars against the night sky when Midori School's cultural winter Festival reached its peak. Red lanterns hung between buildings. Their glow reflected in frozen puddles formed earthbound constellations mirroring the sky above. Steam rose from food stalls, carrying the aromas of takoyaki and amazake through the frigid air. As president of the science club, I had spent the last 5 hours managing our exhibit on optical phenomena. I had explained countless times how light is refracted, reflected, dispersed, repeating basic principles until the words lost all meaning, becoming merely sounds without substance. "Ishikawa-san, are you incapable of having fun?" asked Yuki Tanaka, materializing beside me like an apparition in her traditional navy blue kimono. Vice president of the student council and a model of appropriate behavior, Yuki rarely addressed anyone outside her carefully curated social circle. "Fun is statistically improbable when one has an exhibition to manage," I replied, adjusting my glasses with that gesture my mother called "your barrier against humanity." She laughed, a crystalline sound that seemed misplaced in that hibernal night. Typical of the 3-time physics Olympiad winner. But the festival is for celebrating, not working yourself to exhaustion. The laws of thermodynamics don't pause for festivities, I retorted, though secretly I appreciated her attention. In the merciless social hierarchy of Japanese high school, Yuki inhabited an almost mythical stratum, while I existed in the shadows, buried under equations and theorems. "The festival ends in an hour, and you haven't experienced any of it," she said, her voice softening. "Grant yourself at least a few minutes of adolescent normalcy." Something in her tone, an almost imperceptible note of genuine concern, melted my usual resistance. I designated my assistant to supervise the exhibit and allowed Yuki to guide me through the festival. We sampled dango covered in sweet sauce, tossed rings onto bottles at a game stall, and watched a brief taiko drum performance that reverberated like distant thunder against the school walls. For 45 minutes I was just an ordinary girl enjoying a winter evening. That's when my bladder signaled its inopportune existence. "I need to use the bathroom," I announced, with my usual frankness devoid of social tact. "The ones on the first floor are closed for cleaning," said Yuki, checking her watch. "Use the one on the 3rd floor. It's always empty during events." As I walked away, she added with a mischievous smile, "Watch out for Hanako-san." I rolled my eyes, though an unwelcome shiver ran up my spine. The probability of encountering a supernatural entity is considerably lower than that of suffering an accident from holding urine too long. Her laughter followed me as I entered the main building, silent and cavernous compared to the festive cacophony outside. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, each one amplified by the contrast with the surrounding silence. As I climbed the stairs, the sound of celebration diminished, as if each step transported me not just to a higher floor, but to a more distant, more isolated reality. The 3rd floor had always possessed a peculiar quality, a slightly different, acoustic, as if the air were denser, retaining sounds for a fraction of a second longer. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made my teeth tingle, emitting a bluish clinical glow that didn't seem to belong entirely to the natural spectrum. The door to the girls' bathroom opened with a creak that reverberated through the deserted corridor. The interior was bathed in a bluish penumbra. Only one of the 4 lamps functioned properly, flickering at irregular intervals like Morse code sent by an agonizing entity. The cold was the first anomaly I registered. While the rest of the school maintained adequate heating against winter. Here, the temperature seemed to have plummeted several degrees. My breath formed small clouds before my face, dissipating against the stained tiles. The mirrors, large rectangular panels that covered almost the entire wall above the sinks, seemed to absorb the available light instead of reflecting it. Their surfaces showed a strangely liquid quality under that failing illumination, like pools of ink that occasionally captured my fragmented reflection. Absurd, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding strangely muffled, as if the walls were lined with some invisible acoustic material. It's just an old bathroom with poor maintenance. I quickly used one of the stalls and washed my hands, avoiding looking directly at the mirrors. Not out of superstition, I told myself, but out of pure efficiency. There was no need to check my appearance under such inadequate lighting conditions. It was when I turned to leave that the thought intruded into my mind. The third stall. I had passed it without even registering that it was closed, while all the others remained open. The legend of Hanako-san was well known among Japanese students. The spirit of a girl who died during World War II, or perhaps a victim of abuse depending on the version, who haunted school bathrooms, specifically the third stall. Ironically, superstition is the denial of science, I said aloud, as if articulating a rational principle could dispel the oppressive density that seemed to fill the air. The lamp flickered 3 times in rapid succession, plunging the bathroom into momentary darkness before returning to its weak bluish glow. During those brief instants of darkness, I had the disturbing impression that something had moved behind me. Not a physical movement, but a subtle reconfiguration of reality itself. That's when irrationality overtook me. Not out of credulity, I convinced myself, but out of scientific curiosity. What would be the psychological response of a rational mind when confronted with a superstitious ritual? An interesting experiment in self-induction of altered states of consciousness. I approached the third stall, my footsteps reverberating against the tiles as if amplified by some anomalous acoustic property. Knock. The first knock echoed through the empty bathroom, returning to me like a distorted whisper. Knock. With the second knock, the lamp oscillated, its filament seeming to stretch and contract like a living organism. Knock. The third knock produced no echo whatsoever. It was as if the sound had been absorbed by some invisible density, consumed by something hungry for any vibration. Hanako-san. My voice sounded foreign in my own ears. Are you there? Nothing happened. Relief and disappointment mingled in equal proportions as I turned to leave, a nervous laugh escaping my lips. The practical application of Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is that there's nothing to explain. It was, when I passed the mirror, that I noticed. My reflection hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but enough for my analytical mind to register the anomaly. There seemed to be an infinitesimal mismatch between my movements and their reflected representation, as if time itself functioned differently within that mirrored surface. I stopped, carefully observing my reflection. The girl in the mirror appeared normal at first glance. Same rectangular glasses framing dark brown eyes, same geometrically cut black hair at chin length, same impeccably aligned school uniform. But there was something subtly wrong. An imperceptible asymmetry, perhaps. A difference in micro-expression. I leaned closer, studying each detail with the same intensity I dedicated to particularly difficult mathematical problems. That's when I realized the eyes. While mine blinked reflexively, Hers remained open for a fraction of a second longer. The difference was so minimal that anyone less observant would have dismissed it as a trick of the poor lighting. "Impossible," I whispered, and watched with growing horror as my reflection's lips formed the words a moment after mine. The light flickered again, and when it returned, my reflection was smiling. I wasn't. That smile, too wide, revealing teeth that were strangely uniform and too white to be natural, extended unnaturally across the edges of the reflected face. It was the kind of smile that no human facial muscles could produce, the expression of something that only approximately understood the concept of human joy. I tried to back away but found myself unable to break eye contact with that thing in the mirror. As I watched, paralyzed, the reflection began to change. The transformation was subtle at first, the facial features shifting almost imperceptibly, like clay being remodeled by invisible hands. The hair darkened even more, becoming a blackness that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. It grew in irregular, disheveled strands, falling over a face that was no longer mine. The eyes expanded, the irises dissolving until only completely white eyeballs remained. Not the healthy white of normal eyes, but a milky, sickly white, like dead fish floating in polluted waters. The thing in the mirror tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if its neck contained additional joints not found in human anatomy. Then slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the inner surface of the mirror. That's when I realized it wasn't a gesture of greeting or curiosity. It was a test, the fingers pressing against the surface as if checking its resistance. With growing horror, I watched small cracks branch from the point where those pale fingers touched the glass. The mirror seemed to melt at that point of contact, becoming viscous, almost liquid. And then the hand emerged, not simply reflected, but physically present in my world, breaking the barrier between what should be and what could not be. The fingers were bone white, too long, articulated at points where human joints didn't exist. The nails, black and sharp as obsidian, left red trails on the mirror's surface as they emerged. The substance was unequivocally blood, not the bright red of fresh blood, but a darkened red, almost black, with the consistency of aged syrup. It ran down the cracks that multiplied across the mirror, forming patterns that momentarily resembled symbols of some forgotten language before dissolving into mere chaotic blurs. I understood then, with crystal clarity that contradicts the doctor's narrative about my psychotic breakdown, that the mirror had never been a barrier. It was a portal. And that thing, that entity that now extended a second hand through the bloody surface, was using the form of a child merely as a ruse, a comprehensible approximation of something much older and more incomprehensible. "Hanako-san," I whispered, not as an invocation but as recognition. The creature's smile widened impossibly, literally tearing the face in half, revealing not teeth, but rows of irregular bony protrusions, like stalagmites in a subterranean cave. The hands now completely emerged from the mirror, dripping that viscous dark substance, extended toward me, fingers contorting in configurations that defied all anatomical logic. I tried to back away, but my feet seemed fused to the floor. The creature's face pressed against the inner surface of the mirror, distorting obscenely as it forced passage through that membrane between realities. The white eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that seemed to pierce my consciousness, probing not just my mind but something more fundamental, my very essence. The bathroom light suddenly intensified, becoming incandescent, almost blinding. The mirror vibrated, producing a high-pitched sound, almost ultrasonic, that reverberated painfully through my bones. And then, the hands reached me. The touch of those fingers against my skin was like liquid ice injected directly into my veins. It wasn't just physical cold, but a fundamental absence of heat that seemed to extract not just body temperature, but vitality, identity, soul. In a moment of terrible clarity, I understood that touch was a transfer. Something was being extracted from me and something was being inserted. It was an exchange, a substitution. The creature didn't simply want to drag me into its world. It wanted to take my place in mine. I screamed then, a sound that seemed to emanate not from my throat, but from some deep primordial space within my being. I fell backward, breaking that terrible contact, and hit the floor with a force that expelled all air from my lungs. For one blessed moment, everything went dark. I awoke to the sound of concerned voices and the gentle touch of human hands. "Ishikawa-san, are you okay?" We heard a scream. I opened my eyes to find Yuki and 2 festival monitors kneeling beside me. The bathroom light had returned to its normal state. Weak, intermittent, but decidedly ordinary. "You fainted," explained one of the monitors. "It must be exhaustion. You worked throughout the entire festival without stopping." I nodded weakly, allowing them to help me stand. That's when I noticed the mirror. The surface was covered with red marks, not liquid trails of supernatural blood, but distinct handprints, as if someone had pressed them against the glass after dipping them in red paint. As I watched, paralyzed, I realized the marks formed a pattern, not random but deliberately organized to form 5 Japanese characters. "Jinkara Unite, from now on, we're friends." What is that?" asked Yuki, her voice trembling. The monitors exchanged nervous glances. "Probably a tasteless prank," said one of them, without conviction. "Let's take you to the infirmary." The next morning, the school covered the mirror with a black cloth. The principal announced it had been an act of vandalism, and that those responsible would be punished. But I noticed the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes avoided directly meeting those of the students. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've been through 6 different psychiatrists, 2 treatment centers, and consumed 17 types of medication. None helped. Because the fundamental problem persists. Since that night, my reflection has never been synchronized with me again. It's too subtle for others to notice. A microscopic delay, a gaze that remains when mine moves, a smile that lingers for a fraction of a second longer. Sometimes in the early hours of the morning, when the boundary between dream and reality is thinner, I see those white eyes looking through mine in the mirror, and I know she is just waiting, patiently. The doctors say I suffer from depersonalization derealization syndrome, that my brain, in response to extreme stress, separated my consciousness from my bodily perception. They don't understand that the separation is literal, not metaphorical. That something really inserted itself between me and my reflection. I avoid mirrors as much as possible now. When I'm forced to use them, I keep my eyes down, never sustaining my gaze for more than a few seconds. Because I know what will happen if our gazes meet for long enough. The surface will begin to ripple again, becoming liquid, and this time, the fingers that emerge will be stronger, more determined. They say that if you look into the eyes of your reflection long enough in any mirror at Midori School, you'll see Hanako watching from within. But that's not entirely correct. What no one understands is that she isn't confined to that single mirror, that single school. She's in all mirrors now, especially mine. And she's growing stronger. Sometimes when I'm exhausted or distracted, my hand moves without my command, making gestures I didn't initiate. Occasionally, words come out of my mouth in a voice subtly different from mine. Small anomalies that no one else notices, but which to me are strident sirens announcing the inevitable. She is gradually emerging, not just through the mirror, but through me. Science says that glass flows imperceptibly slowly, but science doesn't know all currents or all realms, and something is flowing toward me, something that used my own reflection as a vehicle, as an entry point. I think it's just a matter of time until I become the reflection, and she the reality. Story 3. The Bodiless Voice. Confessions of a Haunted Professor. There are places where reality is thinner, spaces where the fabric separating our ordered world from the primordial chaos that exists beyond it has worn away, becoming translucent, permeable. I spent 27 years teaching mathematics, a discipline of absolute patterns, of immutable truths, only to discover that numbers, equations, and theorems were mere drawings in the sand, easily swept away by the tide of the incomprehensible. I still teach at Midori Elementary School. The corridors still echo with childish laughter. The bells still demarcate days into ordered segments. Chalk still pulverizes against the blackboard. But now I know there is another layer superimposed over this familiar reality. A palimpsest of horror where the dead whisper through ordinary walls and small invisible hands tug at our sleeves when we think we're alone. On the 3rd floor, in the 3rd stall of the girls' bathroom, something waits. Something that knows my name. I was never a man inclined to fantasies. I was born in the post-war era, when Japan was rebuilding not only its physical infrastructure but also its national identity. Both my parents were scientists. My father, a physicist, my mother, a chemist. Our home was a temple dedicated to rational empiricism, where unexplained phenomena were merely puzzles not yet solved, never intrinsically incomprehensible mysteries. Observe, measure, analyze, my father would repeat like a mantra when I expressed childish fear of night shadows or unexplained noises. What cannot be measured does not exist. I carried this philosophy into my teaching career. For 3 decades, I demystified the world for generations of students, reducing it to constants, variables, and predictable functions. When children whispered about Hanako-san, the spirit supposedly inhabiting the 3rd floor girls' bathroom, I smiled with benevolent indulgence. Your brain, I would patiently explain, is a pattern creation machine. When confronted with incomplete information, such as ambiguous sounds or peripheral perceptions, it fills in the gaps with culturally available narratives. The older students appreciated the scientific explanation. The younger ones seemed disappointed, as if I had stolen something precious from them. None seemed completely convinced. It was on a Thursday in November, when the ginkgo trees in the school courtyard had shed a golden carpet over the gray concrete, that I received the first indication that my understanding of the universe might be catastrophically incomplete. Principal Yamamoto had asked me to close the school. It was a rotating responsibility among the senior teachers. Check all rooms, ensure windows were closed, lights off, and all doors locked. A trivial task that I usually completed in 15 minutes before returning to my small apartment 3 blocks away. I remember the peculiar quietude of that night. Not just silence, but an absence that seemed to have weight, density, substance. The empty corridors amplified the sound of my footsteps until each contact of my shoe against the wooden floor sounded like a hammer striking the inside of an untuned piano. Midori's school building dated from post-war reconstruction, with subsequent additions creating a labyrinth of interconnected corridors. The third floor, housing the music rooms and library, was the oldest, preserving an architecture that evoked an earlier era: higher ceilings, narrower windows, an aura of austere formality that the more modern floors had lost. I methodically checked each room, closing windows, turning off forgotten lights, mentally noting small repairs needed for reporting the next morning. My watch showed 6:42 p.m. when I reached the third floor. The sky beyond the windows had acquired that peculiar quality of early autumn evening, not completely dark, but imbued with a blue-violet luminosity that seemed to emanate not from the setting sun, but from some indeterminate source in the firmament itself. That's when I heard it, the almost imperceptible sound of a muffled sob. I stopped, tilting my head to locate the source. It came again, a fragile sound, like moth wings batting against glass. It came from the end of the corridor, where the girls' bathroom was located. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice sounding strangely compressed in the dense air. "The school is closing." No response. My first assumption was logical. Some student had hidden herself to cry after a social or academic disappointment. Common. Enough in schools, where adolescent emotions frequently overflow. I approached the bathroom, mentally preparing the appropriately sympathetic but firm tone to direct the student home. When I reached the bathroom door, I hesitated. As a male teacher, I rarely entered the girls' bathroom, and only when absolutely necessary for maintenance issues or emergencies. I knocked lightly. "Hello? Is anyone in there? The school is closing now." The sobbing abruptly ceased. The silence that followed had an attentive quality, as if the air itself were listening. I waited perhaps 30 seconds before pushing the door and entering. The bathroom was bathed in bluish light filtered through the single high window, creating a crepuscular aquarium where shadows accumulated in corners like sediment. The stalls lined up against the back wall, all with doors ajar, except the third, which was firmly closed. A sudden cold permeated the environment, manifesting not just as a temperature drop, but as a more fundamental physical sensation, as if something essential was being extracted not just from the air, but from my very cellular composition. My breath formed small clouds before my face, dissipating against the pale tiles that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. "Is anyone there?" I asked, approaching the third stall. "Are you all right?" For a moment, only silence. Then a soft movement like fabric brushing against interior surfaces. I knocked gently on the third stall door. The sound reverberated through the empty bathroom with disproportional resonance, as if there were a much larger space behind that door than the building's geometry would allow. "Hello?" I called again. "We need to close the school now. Are you okay?" The answer came after a disturbing pause, a childlike voice, soft, but with an impossible acoustic quality, as if it were simultaneously near and very distant, filtered through layers of some substance that wasn't air. "Yes. But can you help me? I can't get out." Something in the cadence of that phrase, the micro fluctuations of tone, the infinitesimal pauses between words, sent an icy shiver down my spine. There was an element of unsettling familiarity in that. Voice like a long-forgotten melody suddenly recalled in incomplete fragments. "Of course," I replied, forcing a reassuring professional tone. "Is the door stuck? Can you unlock it?" "I can't," said the voice. "I've been trapped for a very long time." The phrase, perfectly comprehensible in its superficial meaning, contained underlying layers of signification that my rational mind couldn't fully process. There was something profoundly wrong in the way the words "very long time" were modulated, as if the concept of time expressed there didn't correspond to our conventional linear understanding. I tried to turn the handle, but it was firmly locked. Not by a mechanical lock, I realized, but as if something on the other side was holding it, preventing its rotation with precisely the force necessary to neutralize my efforts without revealing active resistance. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to establish a connection while considering how to resolve the mechanical impasse. A pause. Then, "You know my name, teacher." A chill ran through my body, not from the statement itself, but from the way the word "teacher" was pronounced, with an impossible intimacy, as if that voice knew not just my profession, but every moment of my 27 years of teaching, every class taught, every equation written and erased. "I'll get help," I offered, backing away a step. "Please." The voice suddenly acquired a disturbing urgency. "Don't leave me alone again. Just look at me first. I just need you to see me." I bent down then, almost automatically, to look through the space between the door and the floor. It was an impulse born from 30 years of assisting children in difficulty, an instinctive gesture to establish eye contact, offer reassurance. The space under the door revealed the interior of the stall, the white tile floor with age stains, the porcelain base of the toilet. There were no feet inside. The stall, from what I could observe, was completely empty. A wave of disorientation hit me with such intensity that I needed to lean against the wall to maintain balance. The world momentarily seemed to lose its solidity, as if reality itself had been reduced to an uncertain conjecture. "Help me." The voice now emanated directly from the empty space under the door, as if the source were crouched there, invisible, inches from my face. "Help me, help me, help me." Each repetition increased in volume and acoustic distortion, the last manifesting not as ordinary sound, but as a vibration that reverberated through my bones, teeth, and viscera. The childlike quality had been completely abandoned, revealing something underlying that was ancient, vast, and fundamentally alien. It was at that moment that I saw, in the space of perhaps half a second, like a stroboscopic flash of perception, a pair of eyes looking directly at me through the opening under the door. Not human eyes, though they occupied anatomically correct positions. They were entirely white, without irises or pupils, like boiled eggs partially submerged in shadows. I stood up in a rush, backing away several steps, my breathing transformed into irregular gasps that seemed insufficient to sustain consciousness. A sensation of vertigo enveloped me, not just physical but existential, as if the ordered universe I had inhabited for 56 years was suddenly revealing its true nature as something chaotic, vast, and indifferent. The stall door began to tremble, not as a result of someone pulling it, but as if the wood itself had developed an independent vibrational frequency. The tiles around the base of the stall presented fine cracks, branching into patterns that momentarily seemed to contain meaning, like characters of some primordial alphabet beyond human comprehension. A dark substance began to seep from under the door, not water or any ordinary liquid, but something that seemed to absorb light, creating a visual void that expanded across the floor in tentacular patterns. Somewhere distant, an alarm began to sound. It took me several seconds to recognize it as the school's fire alarm system, activated, I would later discover, by an unexplained short circuit in the third-floor electrical wiring. That sharp, constant sound broke the trance of terror that kept me immobilized. I turned and ran, abandoning decades of rational and professional behavior in favor of a much older survival instinct. I rushed through the bathroom, the corridor, the stairs, 3 steps at a time, nearly falling several times, until I burst through the main door into the night air. I spent the night in a state of near-complete dissociation, sitting in my small apartment, unable to process what I had experienced. The conceptual structures that had organized my understanding of the world seemed fundamentally inadequate to contextualize the encounter. The next morning, I laconically reported that I had activated the alarm after detecting a smell of smoke on the 3rd floor. A small lie, but necessary. The alternative would be admitting I had conversed with a bodiless voice or seen impossible eyes where none should exist. For 2 weeks, I maintained my usual routine with mechanical precision, as if normality could be re-established through pure behavioral discipline. I taught, graded papers, participated in pedagogical meetings, all while a part of my consciousness remained fixated on those moments in the 3rd floor bathroom, obsessively re-examining them, seeking some explanation that would preserve my rationalist worldview. It was during this period that I began to notice small anomalies in the school environment, objects that weren't exactly where I had left them, sounds of footsteps in empty rooms, brief peripheral glimpses of a small figure disappearing around corners, and more disturbing, students occasionally turning to look at something that no one else seemed to see, their expressions momentarily frozen in startled recognition before returning to normalcy. The school, I began to realize, was imbued with an underlying consciousness that I could only now detect, as if that encounter in the bathroom had recalibrated my perception, tuning me to a previously inaccessible frequency. In the 3rd week after the incident, I found myself inexplicably drawn to the school basement, where the oldest archives were stored. It was an irrational impulse, completely out of character for my methodical nature, but irresistible, as if an invisible thread were slowly pulling me towards some specific knowledge. The basement was rarely visited, except by the most senior administrative staff. Metal shelves lined up in ordered rows under intermittently humming fluorescent lights, containing boxes and folders organized by decade. The smell of aged paper and dust permeated the air. Without any conscious plan, I went directly to the section containing records from the 1940s, the period of World War II and subsequent Reconstruction. My fingers seemed to move with autonomous knowledge, precisely locating the 1945 to 1946 box, when the school had reopened after the bombings. The folder was there, as if waiting for me, thin, yellowed, containing just a few pages. On the cover, a name, Aiko Yamamoto, 9 years old. With trembling fingers, I opened it. An incident report, typewritten on official paper, detailed the disappearance of a student during an air raid warning on March 5, 1945. Aiko had asked permission to use the bathroom minutes before the warning sounded. When students were counted in the underground shelter, she was absent. After the attack, extensive searches were conducted, but no trace of the girl was found. The report concluded with a clinical assumption that she had likely fled in panic during the warning and been a victim of the subsequent bombing. A black and white photograph accompanied the report, a small girl in formal school uniform, hair cut at shoulder length, somber eyes fixed on the camera with a seriousness beyond her years. I instantly recognized those eyes, though they had been human in the photograph. Beneath the photograph, an almost illegible handwritten note, added decades later by some administrator. Last sighting, girls' bathroom, 3rd floor. Recurring inquiries about unresolved sounds and sightings. Students report constant sensations of being watched at the location. Recommendation: no officially recorded action. I let the folder fall from my suddenly numb hands. In the basement's silence, I clearly heard, though it was acoustically impossible given the distance and structural barriers, the sound of a toilet flushing from the 3rd floor bathroom. And then, more impossible still, the sound of small footsteps coming down the stairs, coming toward me. Since that day, I have lived in 2 worlds simultaneously. In the first, I continue to be Professor Tanaka, respected mathematics educator, man of reason and logic. I teach, guide, evaluate, fulfilling my social role with the same dedication as always. In the second world, which overlays the first like a ghostly transparency, I am the guardian of a terrible knowledge. I know that Aiko Yamamoto never left the school. I know that she remains trapped in that liminal space, neither alive nor properly dead, but existing in some intermediate state, incomprehensible to our limited conception of reality. I know that she is aware of me in a way that transcends simple perception. Since our encounter, a connection has been established that I cannot explain in scientific terms. A mutual awareness that persists independent of physical proximity. I perceive her presence at random moments throughout the day. The sudden cooling of air upon entering an empty room, a glimpse of movement at the edges of my vision, a sensation of being watched when I'm alone, preparing teaching materials after school hours. Sometimes during particularly absorbing lessons, when I'm completely immersed in mathematical explanations, I notice students looking toward the back of the room with perplexed expressions. Following their gazes, I see only the empty wall, but I know instinctively that she is there, watching, perhaps even learning. I religiously avoid the 3rd floor after classes end. When obliged to stay late, I always arrange company, a fellow, teacher, the janitor, anyone to dilute that focused attention that seems to intensify in solitude. But there are moments, usually in the early hours of morning, when I wake to find my apartment permeated by that peculiar cold I now instantly recognize. On these occasions I hear, not with my physical ears but with some recently developed internal sensory organ, a childlike voice whispering through the darkness. "Teacher, you said you would help me. Why did you leave me alone?" Remaining motionless under my covers, I silently respond, "I don't know how to help you, Aiko. I don't know what you need." The answer never comes in words, but as a sensation, a direct knowledge transmitted without linguistic intermediation. She doesn't want to leave the bathroom, the school, or that liminal state of existence. What Aiko Yamamoto desires, what she sought in that first encounter and continues to seek, is much more fundamental. To be seen, to be recognized, to have her continued existence validated by human witness. In her decades of isolation, she has developed a hunger for connection that, transcends conventional physical or spiritual needs. It is an ontological compulsion, the desperate need of a lonely being for external confirmation that it still exists in some meaningful form. I understand this now, though it is knowledge that contradicts everything I've taught for decades. I, Understand that there are forms of existence beyond the parameters recognized by contemporary science. That consciousness can persist in configurations that our instruments and methodologies cannot detect or measure. I understand that Aiko Yamamoto is not simply a ghost in the traditional folkloric sense, but something more complex, a persistent anomaly in the very structure of reality, a knot where the normal rules of physics and metaphysics have been permanently distorted by traumatic circumstances. And more disturbing, I understand that my recognition of her, my awareness of her continued existence, somehow strengthens her not just metaphorically but literally. Each moment of attention I direct to her, each instant of contemplation about her nature, each fragment of fear I feel in her presence serves as some kind of metaphysical nutrition that intensifies her manifestation. This explains why, in recent weeks, I have noticed subtle changes in her presence. She is becoming more substantial, more perceptible not just to me, but occasionally to others. Students increasingly report strange sensations in the third-floor bathroom. Fellow teachers mention unexplained sounds after school hours. The janitor has requested a salary increase, citing unusual working conditions, without elaborating when pressed for details. I speculate, in moments of terrible clarity, that eventually she may acquire sufficient substance to physically interact with our world consistently. What this would mean for the school, for the students, for the very consensual structure of reality, is something I cannot contemplate without a sensation of growing horror. A few nights ago, I woke at 3:17 a.m. to find a small figure standing at the foot of my bed, a dark silhouette against the deeper darkness, only vaguely perceptible, but undeniably present. There were no discernible features, just a density, an absence of light that seemed to contain consciousness. "What do you want from me, Aiko?" I asked, my voice hoarse from sleep and fear. No audible response came, but I felt, like a direct transmission to my consciousness, a series of overlapping impressions, interminable loneliness, a desperate desire for companionship, and something more complex that I can only describe as hunger. Not a physical hunger, but a primordial need to fill a fundamental void. I realized then that Aiko Yamamoto had chosen me not randomly, but specifically, because somehow I possessed something she needed. Some quality, energy, or essence that could satisfy that infinite hunger. "I cannot give what you need," I said into the darkness. "I don't know how to help you move on." The figure remained motionless for several moments. Then, with a movement that defied conventional anatomy, as if each part of her body operated independently of the others, she turned and walked not toward the door, but directly through the solid wall, disappearing like dark ink absorbed by paper. The next morning, I found small wet footprints across my bedroom floor, approximately the size of a 9-year-old child's feet. They evaporated quickly, leaving no residue or mark, as if the very matter composing them didn't entirely belong to this plane of existence. I continue teaching at Midori Elementary School. I continue explaining equations and theorems as if the universe were governed exclusively by quantifiable and predictable laws. I continue inhabiting the ordered world of logic and reason during daylight hours. But I know that this familiar reality is just a thin surface layer superimposed over something much vaster, older, and more incomprehensible. I know that in the spaces between moments, in corners that escape direct perception, there exist entities for which our ordinary conception of existence is inadequate. And I know with growing certainty that Aiko Yamamoto is no longer confined to that stall. That now she follows me, invisible but undeniably present, watching, waiting for the moment when I will finally fulfill my implicit promise to help her. Each night before falling asleep, I check the space under my bed, not because I expect to find something tangible there, but as a silent acknowledgement that the empty spaces in our world may contain presences that our limited senses cannot fully register. And each morning, upon waking, I momentarily look at the mirror, not to check my own appearance, but because sometimes for a fraction of a second, I see a different face looking back, a small, solemn face with eyes that know secrets no child should know. Teacher, a voice often whispers when I'm alone, in the liminal moments between wakefulness and sleep. You promised to help me. Please don't make me wait any longer. I know that eventually I will have to return to that bathroom, to that specific stall, and open that door. What I will find on the other side is something my rational brain refuses to fully contemplate. But I know, with a certainty that transcends empirical evidence, that whatever awaits me there, it will not be just Aiko Yamamoto, but something that merely uses her form, her story, her loneliness as a vehicle to manifest itself in our world. And I am certain too that when I finally open that door, it will not be just to let her out. It will be to invite me in.